Now you can hear Military Matters Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeartRadio TuneIn and Odyssey apps. This episode is brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post 9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. Doesn't it seem like life is getting stranger than fiction? Former FBI agent, Apache pilot, and best-selling author Don Bentley helps me understand the line between reality and make-believe, and how that line sometimes isn't as clear as you might think. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters. At the time of this recording, there was some real weirdness happening in the headlines. Billionaire and son trapped in a submarine near the wreckage of the Titanic was the story that dominated the week of this episode's production. And then the last 72 hours, everything revolved around Wagner Group making a play for Moscow. Russian civil war seemed imminent, and then it all just kind of stopped. It's not hard to imagine these headlines as books or movie plots. After all, based on real events is a tagline we're all too familiar with, slowly fading in and out of your favorite over-the-top action movie or show. But is it really that far of a stretch to think of some lone intelligence operative performing some harrowing action that leads to the abrupt halt and reversal of Wagner tanks and troops? For those in the real world, though, for those in the real world of intelligence and ops, yeah, that's a stretch. Maybe. But there have been real-life incidents and personalities that could have been ripped from the pages of a Tom Clancy novel. Our guest today is the best-selling author of the Matt Drake series and the man behind the 2 latest Jack Ryan Jr. books. Like the protagonist from one of his own works, Don has lived a pretty interesting life, having spent a decade as an Apache pilot, serving as an FBI special agent, focusing on foreign intelligence and counterintelligence, then as a SWAT team member. And now, he's not only writing about his own original characters, but he's also charged with shaping parts of the Tom Clancy universe. The interview you're about to hear is based on real events. Let's get into it.
My wife likes to say that I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, and there's probably a good amount of truth there. And I had, when my debut novel Without Sanction came out, I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake?" which is my protagonist's name. And I said, I am absolutely not him, but I've stood in the same room with him. And that's what I think my career has been. I've been very fortunate to do, is to be able to rub shoulders with men who could be my hero, and to be able to see how they see the world and listen to them talk and hear their stories, and maybe provide a window into that very select community that not a lot of people are lucky enough to experience. And so for me, I've always been a storyteller. Even when I was a kid, I remember writing fan fiction, I guess you'd call it now, of, watching a movie or watching a Star Trek episode and thinking, man, wouldn't it be cool if this would have happened instead? And that's how I think a lot of writers begin, because you have to have that desire to tell a story. You can learn how to write, you can learn kind of the rules of grammar and the foundations of it, but you have to have a sense of story. And so from a young age, I had done that and played around with writing. And when I was a senior in high school, I had an incredible English teacher who took me aside and said, you're good enough, you could actually do this. You could be a writer. And so I took her advice to heart and went and majored in electrical engineering, like all good writers do. And so I got to go to college and on an Army ROTC scholarship, and then went in the Army aviation and got to fly Apache helicopters. And I did that for 10 years, and including a year in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2006, where I was a troop commander. And we were talking earlier about that it was as one of those operations I did. I was the air mission commander for the QRF response team that was trying to go rescue Mike Murphy and the 3 other SEALs that has been, immortalized in the book and the movie lone survivor. And so it was a pretty hard day. It was a pretty pivotal time in my life, because I was the Apaches who were supposed to provide gunship support for the helicopters that were coming in, and the Chinook in front of me was shot down, and I couldn't stop it. And so it makes you examine your life, I think, in a lot of different ways. One of them being it's not to trivialize it, but soldiers, people who train for this, you want to go to combat from the perspective of you want to actually do the job that you spent, in my case, 7 years preparing for. And when something like that happens, it's kind of the equivalent of being a professional football player and you hope your entire career to get to go to the Super Bowl, and you do, and you fumble on the first play and the coach pulls you out, and that's it. And so I felt, kind of like that. And then I also felt like that was the most significant moment of my life, and it went the wrong way, and I can never get that moment in time back. And so what do I do? How do I live my life now? How do I try and find significance? What does that mean? And unfortunately, stories like that aren't all that uncommon from folks who have done combat deployments, or even folks who are first responders or something, right? Where you have a person you can't save if you're a paramedic or you're a police officer, and you make a gut 2-second, microsecond decision, and it goes a long way. And so, all of that is stuff that I pulled into my writing, and I wrote 3 books that didn't sell before writing my 4th that did. And I think one of the reasons why my 4th book sold is because I was finally brave enough to put that kind of stuff in the book, right? To be able to say, what are the things that scare me? What are the things that I've had to work through as a person? And then put those on the pages. And I think when readers respond to a book, it isn't just because it's got great characters or plots or something. I think people recognize veracity, and they respond to that there's something in this book that feels true to me, and it makes it more than a story, I guess. And so it took me a while to figure that out. I think it took me a while to get brave enough to do that. And so now I'm on the other side of that. But I tell people, if you don't count the 3 books I wrote that didn't sell in the 17 years it took me to write them, I'm pretty much an overnight success. So
17 years and overnight.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in those first 3 books. And you describe, it sounds like you were working some things out.
Yeah.
That there was a certain level of healing and maybe some self
For sure.
applied therapy in those books.
Yeah, I think so, especially for the one that sold. I think in the beginning, my editor now says that when you're a new writer and you want to sell fiction, what you have to do is something that's the same but different. And so what that means, we were talking before, one of my good friends is a writer named Brad Taylor, and he commanded at the troop and squadron level in Delta Force, and writes a phenomenal series of books called the Pike Logan series. And so Brad and I both write in the same genre, but I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad does, right? And so if my book is shelved next to his and the reader picks it up and I try and copy Brad, they're going to say, this is okay, but it isn't a Brad Taylor book. And so what I have to do is write something that belongs next to his book, but do it in a way that's uniquely mine, so that the reader will say, yeah, I want to read more of this, because it's not a copycat. It's not the same, but it's in the genre that I like. And so it took me a while to figure out how to do that. And because the first book I wrote, I think, was very much, a carbon copy of a lot of different books that I'd written. It had this kind of protagonist, this kind of thing happen, this whatever. And the second book, I kind of narrowed things down a little bit more and figured it out. By the time I wrote the third book, I had been in the FBI already and had met some interesting people, I guess, as it were, and said, okay, I'm going to try this in a little different direction. And that's the first time where my protagonist surfaced, where I had him as a character. And so one of the authors that is a big influence on me is Nelson DeMille, who's written a gazillion books, but maybe one of his most famous series has a New York detective that's called John Corey. And And he writes it in a first person, which is just kind of writer speak for saying that the character actually tells the story. He says I, and so you hear that character's voice, and it's a really funny voice. And I remember reading the first book with John Corey. It was called Plum Island. And I told my wife afterwards, I'm like, I would read about that guy going to the grocery store, because he's so funny, and it's so much time to spend, or so much fun to spend time with him. And you don't see a lot of that in my genre. And so I thought, you know what, I think I could do that. And so that could be one of the things that's same but different. The other thing I did when I was in the military and when in the FBI, I got to know an organization called DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency. So has a very, very similar mission set to the CIA, but it reports through the military chain of command. And there are a lot of turf battles between the CIA and DIA because they have similar mission sets, because they compete for funding. And so I said, there are a lot of CIA or books about CIA guys and assassins and stuff like that, and special forces guys, but I've never seen a book about a DIA case officer. And a case officer is a word for somebody who runs and recruits assets. And that was very close to what I did as an FBI agent. So I thought, here's another thing that I could bring to the table that would maybe be a little bit different. And then the third thing, one of the guys you and I both worked with is a guy named Jason Beefley, who's a veteran of a special mission unit. And I got to know Jason very, very well and spend a lot of time. He's still the guy I send books to when I have questions and helps it. But he told me a story about one of his first deployments was Gothic Serpent, which is better known by the Black Hawk Down book and movie. And he said, when those Black Hawks crashed and we were going on the site to rescue people, for at least one of them, we already knew the guys inside were dead. We knew they were dead. And we were under fire as we were cutting pieces of that helicopter apart to secure their remains. And we did it anyway. And you think, on the surface, what sense does that make? Like, why would you ever risk the living for people that are already dead? And he explained it, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but out of the stanza of the Ranger Creed that says, never will I leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. And to those of us that aren't part of special operations, those are words. Those are kind of neat sounding words, but they're words. But to people who are part of that community, it's a blood oath, and they take that oath so seriously that they're willing to risk their lives for their already dead comrades, because they're not going to leave them there, because that's what they swore to one another. And so I've been lucky enough to know a lot of people like Jason, and to say, maybe the third thing I can do is to provide a vantage point into those kind of men and what they think and why they do what they do and why they view the world. And so all of those things kind of came together for the third book, and it still didn't sell. And that's where it gets more into what you were asking, where I took a hard look at myself and said, one of my good friends is a writer named Nick Petrie, and his first book is called The Drifter. He writes phenomenal series of books. And he said, in a really good book, a writer is trying to answer a question for themselves in the pages of that book. And I thought, everything that I've written before, I've kind of held at arm's length from myself. I've written about other things or things I'm interested, but I've never really been brave enough to delve in and say, what is the thing that I'm most scared about? What's the question that I would want to have answered? And so, and Without Sanction, the first book in my series and the one that actually sold, the protagonist, Matt Drake, is the DIA case officer has just lost an asset in Syria, and the asset and his asset's family were murdered. And his best friend is a Delta Force guy who was horribly blown up in an IED when he was with Matt trying to recover that asset. And he feels that guilt in that, where do I go from here? How do I actually atone for the fact that I'm still alive and these guys are dead and my best friend is a cripple now? And so, that was really scary. It was really scary to write. It was really hard to delve into, but that's the book that sold. And I think part of the reason why it sold, to your point earlier, is because that's the book where I was brave enough to say, okay, what are the things that scare me? What are the things that keep me up at night? And to put that in fiction.
I think about some of the books I grew up with. And, when I was a teenager, this was the 90s. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't a war quite like the global war on terror. We had, it was Vietnam, it was the Desert Storm, and before that, the Grenada. But there was we didn't see special operations really coming out of the shadows the way that they did in GWAT.
Yep.
I grew up with Richard Marcinko, Brett's, Bravo 20, and then there was the stories out of Vietnam that inspired a whole generation of Green Berets. You, on the other hand, you're coming out of you're a veteran of GWAT, of Afghanistan. Then you went to the FBI. You've surrounded yourself with the zeitgeist of this war on terror, which is where some of the first times I think that conventional people were rubbing shoulders with special operations guys. This is the first time I think that they really came out of the shadows. We're like, we thought Delta guys were 10 feet tall and 6 foot across. And then you're like, oh, you're a normal guy. You're just a human that does a different job. How do you feel that this war and this generation, as accessible as it is to SOF, has influenced your ability to write as opposed to maybe, something that was 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, because if you look back at the writers that you're talking about, that generation, like Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman with a library card, right? Like, he'd never served in the military. He was a voracious researcher, had no military experience at all. Vince Flynn was a bartender. Brad Thor was a travel writer. And so there was a generation of folks who wrote about stuff that they researched but hadn't ever experienced on their own. And now post 9/11, especially in the last, because the forever wars have gone on for 20 something years, you have a generation of writers like Brad Taylor, who we said was a CAG guy, like Jack Carr, who was a Navy SEAL. I was on last night talking with Josh Hood, who was an infantryman in the 82nd Airborne, that are bringing much more lived experience to it. And again, in my case, I certainly deployed to Afghanistan, and we worked as general aviation. Prior to 9/11, our mission set was to go kill Soviet armor, right? Like, that was our job. That's what we trained to do. And there I was in Afghanistan, where you're learning how to do close combat attacks for a SEAL team, right? Which isn't the doctrinal mission you train to, but it's the one. The special operations has played such a huge oversized role in that, like what you were saying, general purpose aviation units or general purpose forces in general find themselves supporting special operations in a way they never had before, or certainly hadn't before the war on terror. In my case, it was more, certainly there's some of my experience that comes into the books, but in my case, it was just the opportunity to meet these guys, and in some cases girls, who are in this community and understand them. When you and I worked for a company together for a while, where our primary customers were within special operations, and then every company I've worked for since then, until I was able to transition to writing full time, the customers have either been folks in the special operations community or folks in the intelligence community. And so for me, when I'd go do customer visits and you'd go out and have a beer and stuff, you're just marinating in the stories that these folks tell you. And in fact, in my Clancy books, especially, a lot of the people on there, with their permission, I've used their names is kind of a tribute to. Now, what I like to do to poke fun of them is, if they were a Green Beret, I make them a SEAL. And if they were a SEAL, I make them a Ranger. And if they were a Ranger, I might make them something like that to do it. But it's, in some of my first Tom Clancy book was called Target Acquired. And there's a whole subplot in there about a Shia cult that's in Syria, and a Green Beret team that's in Overwatch for this cult. And that operation actually happened. It happened in Iraq, but the Green Beret who was the team sergeant when it happened was a friend of mine, and told me and I'm like, can I use this? And he's like, yeah. And so I moved it to Syria because it was what I needed to do for the book. But like, that entire sequence and everything came from talks that I had with customers or people that you get to know. And so I think people ask me a lot, especially because there are so many writers in this genre now who have a military background and say, do I need that? Do I have to have served in the military? And I point them still back to Tom Clancy and Vince Flynn and Brad Thor and say, no, absolutely, you don't need to have that, but you have to understand, you have to either be able to research or talk to people or get those stories and to understand that customer, because the readership can tell. Again, I think people respond to veracity. They can say, like, does this author know what he or she's talking about? And I think, my book certainly stretched the limits of believability in parts where, I don't write a book like Fast and Furious, but I also don't write a book like, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is very, very accurate from an espionage perspective. And so I'll put in Without Sanction, there's a scene where my protagonist does a hey-ho jump into Syria, just him, because he's going to do an asset meet. And so that same guy, Jason Beefley, I gave it to him and he ran me through how to do a hey-ho and what I'd done wrong and what I could do right. And at the end of it, he said, we'd never send just one guy, right? And I said, yeah, I know, but is it a good story? And he said, it's a great story. And I'm like, that's what I'm trying to do. And so I will unabashedly err on the fact of pushing the limits to tell a great story, but I won't make the mistakes, at least intentionally, when it comes to the men and women who could be characters in my books.
Homes for Our Troops, HFOT, is a publicly funded nonprofit organization that builds and donates specially adapted custom homes nationwide for severely injured post 9/11 veterans to enable them to rebuild their lives. These homes restore some of the freedom and independence our veterans sacrificed while defending our country. Nearly 90 cents out of every dollar spent has gone directly to supporting our veterans and enabling them to rebuild their lives. Visit hfotusa.org. That's hfotusa.org to learn more. Wreaths Across America Radio is a voice for America's veterans, an awesome mix of contemporary country, patriotic, and public service programming. And now Military Matters is proud to include itself into that mix. So now you can listen to this podcast, Military Matters, Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Odyssey apps. Some folks might be wondering, well, why are we talking to a writer of fiction? On this show, we typically cover real life things that are happening with housing and true crime. And we even talked about UFOs, but we talked about it from like the UAP perspective. Yeah. So one of the things I think is interesting about what you do and Tom Clancy and Brad Thor, who I'm a big fan of these writers as well, is the ability for us to indulge in fantastic stories, but the value that comes out of being able to look at these stories as a step back and go, well, maybe that's not real, but how do we handle these things in real life as military leaders, as decision makers?
Yeah.
Have you found yourself, kind of as you create these plots, thinking about the real world applications and how these things would be approached for real? Like Jason's, like, 2 guys, 3 guys. Tell me about that process.
Yeah. So I think the answer is twofold. So on one, it's really interesting that thriller writers, especially in that genre, what you're trying to do is kind of what the S2 or the intelligence officer does in a normal military unit. And so when I was the last book in my Matt Drake series was called Hostile Intent. Yeah. And I wrote it. I knew I wanted to write a book that took place in Europe. I wanted to do more of a force on force, show like a bigger, broader, get away from just the special operations. And I was like, well, what could I do in Europe that would be a force on force, that would be really interesting, that would be more like the older, like Red Storm Rising? And I was like, what about a Russian invasion of Ukraine? And so I wrote that book, about a year before there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so people were like, well, how did you figure that out? And I said, what is being in the military, especially as an officer, what they teach you how to do is to put on the enemy's hat, which is what a good intelligence officer does, and say, what does the enemy commander think about this? How is he or she going to behave? And in fact, when you do the terrain board rehearsal before the mission, the intelligence officer goes to the opposite side of the board, and he or she is the enemy battalion commander or brigade commander. And what they're responsible for is articulating how is the enemy going to behave, what they're going to see, what the friendly forces are, and allocate their forces this, and how are they going to react to it. And so it gives you that tools to look at a situation and say, how would the bad guys look at this? How would this actually happen? And in fact, after September 11th, I think it was the Department of Defense or something pulled a bunch of thriller writers together, and Brad Thor was one of them, and did a series of red cell exercises that were like, what are you guys seeing as you look out there? What are you interested in? And what do you think is the next threat? Precisely for that reason, because your job isn't necessarily to predict what current events are going to happen. It's to crawl in somebody else's head and say, how will they react? And so you get to do a lot of that, and a lot of trying to say, how would the world work if X or Y or Z did? And so it's been really fun to do. But it also, as a thriller writer, you never want real events to catch up to what you're actually doing. And so the Ukraine, my book came out like a month after Russia actually invaded Ukraine. And it was funny because people were asking me about it, and they're like, what did you get wrong? What did you get right? And I was like, I think I got some of the tactics right and stuff that the Russians used and how they were going to go about it. What I completely missed, that I think most of the world missed, was the tenacity and ferocity of the Ukrainian people and how they would resist. Because frankly, up until then, what we'd seen is stuff like Afghanistan, where there were certainly some elements within the Afghan National Army that were fierce fighters, but on a whole, and the civilian populace on a whole didn't stand and fight. Or Iraq, the whole world watched as the Iraqi army melted, as ISIS gained a foothold and did it. And so I think we were preconditioned to look at the world that way. And then you see Ukrainians, average people standing and fighting and refusing to let the Russians run over them, I think was certainly something that I missed, and certainly something a lot of people missed. And so you do get better, I think, at predicting things like that, but you never get all of them right, for sure.
It's fascinating. And one of the things you just talked about was, when you're doing these G2 sessions, or when you're working as a red cell, one of the things that we often, I don't think a lot of civilians understand, is that it's not like Don Bentley is the red cell guy and he's going to attack American forces as an American tactician. Yep. There are countless reams of books and manuals that have explored, again, going back to the DIA, right? The DIA goes out and they send their people so they can find out, how does a Russian commander think? How would a Russian commander maneuver a tank element or an armor element versus how would we do it? And that's the key, is we're not fighting versions of ourselves in these scenarios. You really have to jump into the role, that commander.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something I think is very interesting as a writer, and I'd love to know more about this. Your ability to immerse yourself in the villain, in the bad guy, for all intents and purposes. Do you find yourself going to some dark places when you're writing these plots, and how do you find your way out?
Yeah, I think that can certainly be the case. I think the villains come in a whole wide range of stuff. You've got everything from like the classic Hannibal Lecter that terrifies the person who is the archetype of a villain and stuff, right? To the thing, what I do more, like in my latest book that comes out, is called Forgotten War, that comes out on April 25th, and that takes place during the 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan. And because like a lot of Afghanistan veterans, I saw that and it just wrecked me. And it's funny because I think most, and I don't want to characterize, but I think a lot of folks who had fought in that 20-year war would have been fine saying, okay, we're done with Afghanistan. I mean, my son was born shortly after 9/11. he's in the middle of earning his commission as a Marine Corps officer. And as a father, I couldn't fathom that he would have to go back to Afghanistan and still fight. But you watch the way it crumbled and you're like, it can't end like this. Like, this can't be the way that it all ends, and we lose everything. And so I knew I had to write a book during that period of time, and I wanted to set a lot of it in Afghanistan. And so one of the antagonists, bad guy, is a Taliban leader, right? And so I made him as one of the folks who spent a lot of time in the kind of the notorious prison there in Bagram that the Afghans run. And so I think part of making bad guys compelling is getting in their head and saying, why do they do what they do? What makes them sympathetic? And, when you read the stories, different stories talk about how those guys by other Afghan jailers and stuff were tortured and what they went through and stuff. And not that they're nice guys. I don't want to give that impression, but you think about what would be in his head when he got out of that prison 10 years later, and what would he want to do and how would he want to go about doing that? And it kind of gives you, it gives you a vantage point into, even if you don't agree with it, you understand why he might do what he does. And I think that's what makes it more compelling to the writer. But certainly for me, it wasn't necessarily a dark place writing that book about the antagonist as much as it was trying to wrestle with what happened during that withdrawal, what our response was, what that meant. The thing I said, that Forgotten War is certainly fictional, but many of the things that happen in it were based on actual events, and much of the conversations between the different veterans of Afghanistan that populate that book were taken from actual conversations I had with people. And, the refrain that I kept hearing over and over again was it even worth it? Was it even, for 20 years, this is what we did. We lost friends there. We lost time there. We poured away blood and treasure. Was it even worth it? And so that was to me, that was the darker part of that book, because Afghanistan is like that cornerstone that the entire war on terror is built on. And so you take that away, and then people are looking at Iraq and saying, well, was that worth it? Were the time we spent there, the friends that we lost there, and it's like the whole house of cards is then threatened at that point, where you look at everything that you've done, especially the guy, Alan Mack, that I was talking to before this, is a 160th pilot. He deployed 17 times to Afghanistan, 17 times. And so, my best friend was a guy named Kelsey Smith. He and I were troop commanders together in Afghanistan. He deployed a total of 6 or 7 times. I mean, that's 7 years away from his family for tours to Iraq to Afghanistan. And you need that to be worth it, right? At the end of the day, you need it to be worth something. And so the notion is of that maybe it wasn't, or even the notion of just calling that into question was a super dark place while I was writing that book.
And that's another reason I think that we need fiction. It allows us, I think, to have this dialogue about how we're experiencing the wind downs, the shutting down of these war zones in a way that, I hate to say it, we can kind of separate ourselves. We can, it's a way to detach from the reality of it and have that discussion as fiction, but really maybe as a national, or maybe as a country, we are healing through fiction. I want to talk about Tom Clancy here and Vince Flynn, because I did not know, I'm not a writer of any sort, I didn't know you could give people your characters. I didn't know this, or lend them out, as you will. This has happened to you, and it wasn't just some person that just like, hey, I have a character, go do something. This is Tom Clancy. This is the guy that I grew up with, Rainbow Six. I told you, I'll never forget the scene. I think they were in like a Disneyland park and shooting some kid in a wheelchair. Like, I was like, what is going on here? It is now your world. Tell me about that. How does that even work?
Yeah. When Tom Clancy died about 10 years ago, The guy that is my editor, I apologize, there are a couple Toms in this story, is a guy named Tom Colgan. And so he was Tom Clancy's editor before Tom died. And so the Clancy estate came to him and said, hey, people love the universe Tom Clancy's created, and we would love for that to be able to live on in some form or fashion. And so what they did was allowed Tom Colgan to go out and find it's only 2 writers at a time to write in that universe. And so the way that it works is there's one writer who does what's called the Jack Ryan Sr. book. So in the Clancy universe, Jack Ryan Sr. is probably in his 60s or late 60s, something like that, has been president for a long time, will probably be president for the rest of the series. And then his son is Jack Ryan Jr., is about the same age as the Jack Ryan character in the Amazon Prime series, right? So if you watch that series and you go to the Clancy books, it's a little confusing because there's such a dissonance. Now, if you go to the books and you read, and I get to write the Jack Ryan Jr. books, that character is pretty much the character that I write in my books. And so what the Clancy estate does is allows that editor to manage the writers. And so they get just 2 writers at a time, and he decides who he's going to invite in, kind of how many books they're going to get to write in that universe, kind of in the same way with fewer writers, but like what George Lucas did with Star Wars, or the people who owned Star Trek did with that, except for they only bring in those 2 writers at a time to do it. And so I was fortunate enough. Tom Colgan is kind of a legendary editor, and he bought my first book without sanction in a 2-book deal. And so when I turned in my second book to him that was called The Outside Man, you have what's called the editorial call, which means he's read the version of the book you send him. And then you schedule a call where you can talk about what his impressions are and kind of what he wants you to change or where he thinks the book could be better. And so at the end of that conversation, it was kind of almost like Columbo-esque, where he's like, I got one more question for you. Would you be interested in writing in the Clancy universe? And I'm like, what did he just say? And so it happened that the guy that was writing it before me, his name was Mike Madden, decided that he didn't want to write them anymore. And so Tom goes out and knew me and offered me the opportunity to do that. And so this year, Forgotten War comes out in April, and then I have 2 Clancy books that come out. So Flashpoint comes out at the end of May, and the book I'm currently finishing now is called Weapons Grade, and that'll be my 4th Clancy novel, my 8th book overall, and that comes out in August. And so in addition to Tom Clancy, they also do this with the Bourne books, so the Jason Bourne universe. My friend Josh Hood that I was talking about earlier, he writes in that universe. Brian Freeman does. And then W.E.B. Griffin, they've written a couple of books in his universe as well. But what's really hard is that nobody. So Tom, when he invited me into the gig and I said yes, and he's like, look, nobody can write like Tom Clancy. Nobody can be him. And he's like, don't try and do that. He's like, I just want you to do what you do, but do it in this universe. And so that kind of gave me some confidence, because I was super nervous about coming in and doing it, because you're literally standing on the shoulders of giants, right? That you don't want to be the guy who crashed the Clancy universe and brought it to a screeching halt. And so he was very good about, making sure I understood that it wasn't my job to mimic Clancy. And then the other thing he said to me that really resonated is he said, my gift as an editor is in finding the right writers to come in and take this over. And he's like, you're the right writer because I said you are, go out and do good things. And so in the same token, when Vince Flynn died, which was about the same time as Tom Clancy, about 10 years ago, the estate reached out and found this fantastic writer named Kyle Mills, and he's been writing it for about the last 9 or 10 years. And then he decided that he didn't want to do it anymore. And Vince Flynn is my favorite all-time writer. He is the one who was the first post 9/11. I'm going to have this protagonist who unabashedly goes out and shoots bad guys in the face. Like, his job is to hunt down terrorists and to be vengeance for his nation. And so all of us who write in that genre have in some form or fashion, I think, modeled our protagonist or been influenced by him. And so, I never thought when my third book didn't sell, I knew there was something wrong still from a writing perspective. And so I took my favorite Vince Flynn book and I broke it down scene by scene with note cards, and I taped it to the wall of my bedroom because I didn't have an office at that point. And it was kind of like the difference between looking at a house or looking at the blueprints of a house. I could see what he had done as a writer and stuff. And so, fast forward to now, the fact that I get to take over his series, I'm still trying to wrap my head around, but that's how it works. So it's not that just the characters are out there and you can ask as a writer to say, hey, I'd like to write one. The estate manages that, and they usually manage it through the editors. And so and most people are pretty good about it, but I get the troll comments all the time, like, you should be ashamed of yourself for profiting off Clancy's name. How could you? And I was like, you know what? First of all, he's the one profiting off his name. And then secondly, to me, it's the same way, I was a big Star Wars fan, and I loved it that when Lucas opened that up and say, here's a universe, let's bring other talented writers in to give these characters lives and not let them die and be able to see it more. And I feel like that's what I get to do with the Clancy and the Vince Flynn estates.
It's funny. I was going to ask you, did you feel the weight of this? And like, folks, like, you better not F this guy up, because like, there's this character. I love this character. Yeah. Don't do him dirty, Don.
No, so with the Clancy one, there had been another friend of mine, Mark Graney. He writes the Gray Man series. In fact, his first book, The Gray Man, was just made into a movie not too long ago. He wrote while Tom Clancy was still alive with Tom, and then wrote the first book after Tom had died. And there's been several writers in the Clancy world who have done that. There's probably been 4 or 5 or so. And so me coming on in that, it wasn't as big a deal. When they announced that I was taking over for the Flynn one, the world went crazy. Like, it was actually trending on Twitter for a while, because there had only been one writer. There's only one series. Vince Flynn was huge. He's so beloved. And so most people were nice, but I got a lot of messages that were like, we love Mitch Rapp. Don't mess this up. Like, welcome to the universe, but you got big shoes to fill and you better not screw this up. And you know what? I appreciate that, because the amount of dedication that the fans have to that character and that universe is, a testament not only to the world that Vince created, but the fantastic job that Kyle Mills did. And so it was daunting. My Josh Hood describes it as kind of getting tossed the keys to your dad's, 1970 something Stingray, and you want to take it out and drive it as fast as you can, but you want to bring it back without any extra dings on it too. And so that's what it feels like a little bit.
You've done amazing work, and it's been recognized by folks at the highest level. Sure. You've done this work in the realm of, I would call it, action, thriller, espionage. Mm-hmm. Is there another genre that Don Bentley wants to perhaps look? I mean, is there a romance novel in your future? Is there a sci-fi? What do you want to kind of test your chops on?
Probably not romance for sure, but I'm a big fantasy fiction lover. And my first couple of books that I tried to write that didn't finish were all fantasy books. And one of my favorite writers now writes an urban fantasy series. His name is Jim Butcher, and it's about a wizard in Chicago, but he writes it as almost kind of like gumshoe detective stuff. So, somebody walks into his office and says, I have this problem, and he helps it. And for my 2 cents, Jim Butcher does tension better than, a lot of quote unquote thriller writers. And I look at his books and kind of tear them apart and say, how is he always increasing the tension? How is he doing this stuff? So I don't know that I have, that I would write a fantasy book, but I think after this year, the next book I'll be working on is a Vince Flynn book. And then I'm not sure what book I'm going to write after that. So it might be another Clancy book. It might be another Matt book. It might be a standalone book. And so we'll see. I think it's Yeah, I'm a big music fan too. And when Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters died, Rolling Stone published one of his last interviews, and they were asking him kind of like, what's it like being the drummer in the Foo Fighters? Because traditionally the drummer is not the guy who has a lot of creative direction and stuff like that. And he said, it took me a while to figure out what I actually had. And he said, because in the beginning, I would push Dave Grohl for more creative control or more ability to do stuff. And then he's like, I finally figured out I'm the drummer in the Foo Fighters, and I get to live in this amazing house in Beverly Hills. And I've got these side projects that are my, passion music projects and these little bands. But at the end of the day, I still get to be the drummer in the Foo Fighters. And so that's kind of how I'm approaching it now is that I'm lucky enough to be the guy who gets to write the Vince Flynn books. And I still have my own series. I still have a couple of other things, but even if those don't work out at the end of the day, I still get to be the drummer in the Foo Fighters, and that's not a bad thing.
That's freaking amazing. Do you have any last words, parting comments for folks listening in the military space?
Yeah, just if I always love hearing from people. You can find out more about me at my website. It's donbentleybooks.com, just Bentley. And Forgotten War comes out on April 25th. So would love to hear from folks and would love to hear from folks to pick up a copy. So thank you.
Folks, that was the extraordinary Don Bentley. You can find out more about Don, his books, and what he's working on right now. Go to donbentleybooks.com. Link is in the show notes. And of course, you can find Don's books anywhere books are sold. And while you're perusing the interwebs, buying your Matt Drake books, folks, be sure to head over to stripes.com and use promo code podcast to get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes, the news source that has supported American service members no matter where they've been deployed to. Stars and Stripes has been there and continues to be there, so drop some characters in your address bar, stripes.com, promo code podcast, and lock yourself in for 50% off your digital subscription. Maybe Don can write something about Matt Drake putting down his Stars and Stripes right before he, saves the day and kicks someone's face off. I don't know, Don. I'm just an idea guy. You're the professional writer. Folks, that does it for me. I'm Rod Rodriguez, and I will see you at the next episode. This episode was brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post-9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. Now you can hear Military Matters Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeartRadio TuneIn and Odyssey apps.